the Pre-Adamic race, or the Pre-Adamic earth. The earth is much older than 6,000 years, but our creation started about 6,000 years ago with a literal 6-day creation. Therefore, I reject that the Bible account of creation is figurative of a type of organic evolution in which all living things evolved from simpler varieties. The record of Genesis chapter 1 to 3 describes the literal work of God in creating this world and its creatures out of the previous void and chaos. Each day was a period of 24 hours duration and does not permit an evolutionary process. Before the 6 days' work began, Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2 shows us darkness on the face of the deep, the earth without order and void. The very first incident described is the movement of the Spirit of God on the face of the waters, the same verse, from which it follows the earth and the water existed before the reorganizing work of 6,000 years ago began. The earth had a history before the 6 days' work, as further evidence from the words addressed to Adam, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth." Both the Bible and geological records show it was a history marked by upheaval and ending in catastrophe. The Bible shows us the recovery from that state by the 6 days' work ending in the appearance of Adam on the scene. So to summarize then, the earth existed for millions of years before the Adamitic era. Fragments, however, of the pre-Adamitic world have been brought to light by geological research. Organic remains, coal fields and oil belong to the ages before the formation of man rather than to the time of creation or the flood. If it be suggested that the fossil remains of the past include human remains as well as remains of other races, the answer has to be made that there is a lack of scientific evidence that these remains are identical with the human race. The animal and vegetable remains are those of species now largely extinct, belonging to pre-Adamitic ages, and analogy would require that what are considered human remains, if they are human remains, which is by no means certain from the evidence, are the remains of an anterior race existing at a remote time when as yet the earth had not been overtaken by the upheaval which brought it to that state, developed in darkness and submerged in the deep, depicted to us in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2. So to summarize once more, the earth existed prior to the literal 6 days of Adamitic creation, that there was life on earth prior to a catastrophe which left the earth covered with water according to Yahweh's will. Were there other human beings contemporary with Adam and Eve? There are at least 4 biblical hints that there were other human beings in existence at the time of Adam and Eve. Eve is told, "I will greatly increase your labour pains," Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16. The word increase implies one of 2 options. Either God had already planned for there to be pain in childbirth. Remember that at this point Eve hadn't had any children, but now God was going to increase it. Hardly seems likely, or else Eve was not the first to have had children, hence the increase, because others hadn't had the pain before. Cain is afraid he would be killed. Genesis chapter 4 verses 14 and 15. Who would Cain be afraid of if the only other people on earth are his parents and perhaps a younger sibling or 2 that are not mentioned in the Bible, and the marking of Cain so that no one would kill him hardly sounds necessary if it was only his family. The context of the thought in these verses only makes sense if there are other people on the earth. Cain finds a wife and builds a city. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 17. There are two concepts to consider here. Firstly, who was Cain's wife? God's moral compass does not change. In other words, God's moral values would be consistent. Leviticus is quite clear that relations with one's sister, not to mention other close relatives, are strictly forbidden, and it is a sin and wickedness and a disgrace, and a cause of his anger against the Canaanites. See Leviticus chapter 18 verses 6 to 18, Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 17 and verse 23. To imply this was Cain's sister not only inserts a concept into the text that is not there, because the scriptures specifically do not say he took his sister, but it also requires God's moral compass to do a 180-degree turnaround. Secondly, who lived in his city? Surely more than Cain, his wife and his son Enoch. The text appears to assume the existence of a large number of other people in the area. After Adam and Eve's first grandchild was born, people began to worship Yahweh. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 26. If the only human beings were Adam and Eve, their children and grandchildren, it makes no sense to say that people began to worship Yahweh. Abel had previously been faithful, and it appears that Adam and Eve remained faithful after they left Eden. See Genesis chapter 4 and verse 25. So at least some of the family were already worshipping God. The verse only really makes sense if these people are those who were not part of the family of Adam and Eve. So throughout the early chapters of Genesis, there are many hints of a wider human population that existed at the time